On the obligations to ground community. This is a paper I presented at Boston College in March 2017, almost 9 years ago, at a conference titled The Territory of a People, Questioning Community. I just found it the other day and I thought, it's a pretty good paper. It's been 9 years, so, I feel like I've grown, but I think it was worth recording my reading of it. And I just got these new lights and a new microphone, so I wanted to try out the new setup. So here we go. This paper explores the relationship between obligation and community in the works of Immanuel Kant and Henri Bergson. Both of these thinkers attempt to ground community. My goal is to provide you with a sort of raw material for your own thinking, rather than making definitive claims on how to interpret these authors. What I hope to show, though, is that community plays a central role in both of their philosophical projects and shed light on the diverse ways in which they developed the concept. For Kant, the problem is transcendental. What are the conditions for the possibility of community? The first critique gives a precise definition of community by making it a pure concept of the understanding. Community, as a category, falls under the third table of relation alongside substance and causality. Community is the way that substances appear related to each other insofar as they interact. To interact has a precise meaning. Substances interact if they reciprocally condition each other's existence. Object A and B are in community when both A is an agent responsible for some determination in B, and reciprocally, B is the agent responsible for some determination in A. It is by being in community that many objects can relate and form a meaningful system. As Kant writes, quote, "Without community, every perception is broken off from the others. An experience would have to start entirely over with every new object, without the previous one being in the least connected or being able to stand in temporal relation with it." End quote. Without cognizing appearances through the concept of community, we could not have many objects in mutual coherence. We would only be capable of relating objects in a series, A, then B, then C, etc., but would not be able to perceive them as simultaneously present. I look at objects A, then B, then C, and then I reverse the order C to B to A, and I find that they are bound by an irreversible series of appearances, and thus they exist simultaneously. But simultaneously existing substances could never be perceived unless they were first receiving reciprocal influence from one another. Objects in complete isolation, as Kant says, quote, "would not be objects of a possible perception, and the existence of one could not lead to the existence of the other by any path of empirical synthesis." End quote. Thus, community is a necessary component to the appearances of objects in general. It is a necessary condition for thinking multiplicity at all. We must differentiate between community as denoting the membership to a given whole with commerce, which refers to the dynamical community. Commerce emphasizes the active aspect of the reciprocal relationship. This way of interacting is more than causality, which subordinates one substance to another in a series. For example, when object A determines something in B, but not the other way around. Interaction implies that the parts do not simply act on each other, i.e., relate causally, but rather their actions are coordinated such that the activity of each sustains the coherence of the whole. This implies that each part involves something of the other parts in its own determination. The dynamical community among objects in appearance brings the manifold into an objectively valid coherent whole, what Kant calls the world whole. Our body is the mediator of our perception of the world. As Kant says, quote, "From our experience, it is easy to notice that only continuous influences in all places in space can lead our senses from one object to another, that the light that plays between our eyes and the heavenly bodies affects immediate community between us and the latter." End quote. And furthermore, we cannot perceive any alteration of spatial relations, quote, without matter everywhere making the perception possible. Nature, as we perceive it, must appear in community. But it is only from our speculative interest that we are in any way obliged to ground the concept of community. The communities for which we have empirical knowledge impose only material obligations on our faculty of judgment in the form of space and mechanical laws of nature. In this sense, the obligation is merely an analogy. In the third critique, community again plays a central role in aesthetic judgments as the sensus communis, or common sense, which is a, quote, faculty for judging that is, in its reflection, takes account a priori of everyone else's way of representing in thought in order, as it were, to hold its judgments up to human reason as a whole, end quote. Common sense makes aesthetic judgments, although they are subjective, they are nevertheless universal, and thus aesthetic judgments are grounded in an ideal community of taste, whereby we judge the object as universally beautiful to all people. While the term community is not used in the third critique beyond the sensus communis, it is nevertheless implicitly at the center of teleological judgments, that is, natural ends. Kant refers to natural ends as reciprocal relations which form a whole, and whereby the whole forms an end to which the parts are means. But the parts are not merely means, and rather they are ends too, insofar as they partake of the whole. Quote, for a body, therefore, which is to be judged as a natural end in itself, it is required that its parts reciprocally produce each other, as far as both their form and their combination is concerned, and thus produce a whole out of their own causality, end quote. Each part produces its effect, but the effects all intermesh into a single whole, because the parts reciprocally produce each other. Ends, in general, are characteristic of a community. The organism is the end for which the organs are means, but the organs are ends as well, because the system of organs simply is the organism. The system is not reducible to the mechanical causality underlying it, but they are nonetheless explained through mechanics alone. Thus, we wouldn't claim that the parts act out of obligation to participate in their ends. Obligation is only relevant to freedom, and bodies must be understood in terms of mechanical causality. Even the judgment of taste, although it is grounded in the activity of freedom of the subject, still has the sensible manifold as its object, and does not make freedom itself its object. There is a special problem when we attempt to think of a community of free subjects which makes no appearance in sensibility. This gives rise to Kant's notion of community as a transcendental idea. The community of free subjects, what Kant calls the kingdom of ends, is simply unthinkable by speculative reason. As Kant makes clear, quote, thinking is the action of relating given intuitions to an object. And end quote, while a community of ends is not an object we can think, it is nevertheless an object which we must think. Kant makes the realization of this end both our highest obligation and, more importantly, the source of obligation itself. When the faculty of reason sets itself the task of legislating the moral law, it does so by subjecting itself to the universality of the moral law. Kant expresses the universal law in the categorical imperative, to will that one's maxims be universalized. This is a pure act of the will because it enacts its interest of reason to will its own obedience to universal obligation. As Kant says, quote, thus the will is not subject simply to the law, but so subject that it must be regarded as itself giving the law, and on this ground only subject to the law. Thus, the ultimate end of the free will is freedom itself, insofar as freedom sets the legislation of the universal law as its end. While we set ourselves any number of ends, of which our inclinations for happiness and pleasure are justified, we remain with ends which serve only our self-love. When I make the other a means to my ends, then I subordinate them to my interest, rather than having their interest mutually determine my own. There can be no community of means. Only through our mutual resistance do we interact and form community. Only a community of ends constitutes a moral community. A community of means is not even a natural end. It is simply unorganized. In the kingdom of ends, obligation takes on a pure form, where the agent and patient are identical. Now, Henri Bergson, who tends to have a Kantian flavor throughout his work, nevertheless did reject the notion that obligation can have its source in reason. Bergson radically temporalized community and obligation. Obligation emerges only from social pressure. Bergson shifts the focus towards understanding how the sense of obligation has actually arisen in history. For Bergson, social obligations are imposed collectively by the members of the community in the form of laws and norms, handed down from generation to generation. The two sources of morality in religion, he writes, whether human or animal, a society is an organization. It implies a coordination and generally also a subordination of elements. It, therefore, exhibits, whether merely embodied in life or in addition specifically formulated, a collection of rules and laws. End quote. While animal society is almost completely organized by instinct, human societies are organized in language. In the societies of our ancient ancestors, Bergson identifies what he calls the myth-making function that accomplishes this organization in its earliest form. Obligation is mythological. As human intelligence develops, language's role becomes more complex. Calculation, reasoning, allow for formations of complex law systems. Yet, language is itself, quote, the product of custom, end quote. And customs are the social habits formed in response to a mutual sense of obligation. Our sense of obligation is what motivates us to fix laws and rules, even the rules of language. But obligation cannot come from the laws themselves. Obligation in the sense of being reciprocally determined by others. To cultivate the social ego is the essence of our obligation to society, Bergson says. And continuing, if there were not some part of society in us, it would have no hold on us, end quote. The social ego is the determination of our identity by relationships to other people. It is not simply impressed on us. Rather, we construct our social identity as a response to our interactions with others. Bergson's account of obligation is a result of his theory of tendencies in the evolution of the élan vital. For Bergson, it is this vital impulse which is the immanent cause of community and our sense of obligation. The élan vital is the principle of creativity in the universe and is closely linked to Bergson's notion of real duration. We are mistaken to try to explain reality by reconstructing movement with immobile parts, to express change by the results of the process, and in general to think that discontinuity has any existence beyond its abstraction from continuity. The élan vital cannot be thought as a concept, entity, or even a force. It is the continuity of life which has manifested itself in billions of life forms which we see in the fossil record, but is not reducible to the forms that have been left behind. The sense of life which each of us feels is the community of the élan vital as it presses into the future. The élan vital as a form of duration is a contraction of the past into the present, so a coexistence of the past with the becoming of the present. Just as we hear a musical motif as immediately related to the preceding sections of the score. The whole of the evolutionary advance of life is gathered up in the present moment of nature's creative advance. It's not an ideal filing cabinet of natural history in immobile concepts, but the living continuity of life as duration. While the fossil record shows only dead remains of past life, in reality, the entire present biosphere, of which we are a part, is connected by an unbroken continuity with past life on Earth. It's central to Bergson's method that this continuity of duration be immediately evident. Take the most important example for Bergson, movement. We see immediately the continuity of movement as an indivisible act. When I wave my hand, we immediately see the simple act, which only afterwards can be divided into coordinates. This division inserts positions that my arm was supposed to have occupied in its trajectory, each being successively surpassed. Yet in reality, my arm never occupied any points. It was continuously moving. Immobility does not ground the movement which it represents. It is only by first having experienced movement that we would ever hazard to represent movement with its immobility. The same must be true of the movement of life in its creative advance. We can divide the continuity into finite immobile products, and this is useful for understanding it, but we must not think that this representation can account for its reality. The movement of the élan vital has two dominant tendencies, on the one hand towards torpidity, and on the other, movement. Torpidity, immobility, rigidity, movement, creativity, adaptation. The torpid tendency of the élan vital is taken to the extreme in the plant kingdom, where storing energy is made possible by becoming immobile. Plants are capable of storing a great deal of energy, but in order to do so, they have had to forfeit all mobility. The reverse tendency towards movement, change, and creativity produced the animal kingdom. Animals took advantage of these stores of energy provided by plants and used this energy store to move. This requires a great deal of energy, and this is what Bergson calls an explosive release of energy. It's an explosive release of energy taken from plants and made animal. This tendency toward mobility is further progressed in mammals by giving up hardened scales and armor to achieve a never-before-seen mobility and adaptability to their environments. This tendency towards suppleness, mobility, greater releases of energy is most essentially expressive of the élan vital. Humans have developed along this mammalian line, which tends towards mobility. Human intelligence can be seen, though, nevertheless, as a move back towards rigidity and torpidity. It introduces fixity and mobility into movement. Nevertheless, it is a development in the direction of mobility with respect to instinct. The intellect is ambivalent in this respect. While instinct fosters life with a sense of possible actions which are executed unconsciously and automatically, the intellect provides an awakening from the unconscious reaction of instinct by delaying, hesitating our immediate response, presenting life with a multitude of possible actions. This delay is, for Bergson, the beginning of freedom. The intellect for Bergson is not entirely Kantian. As he says in Creative Evolution, quote, "Intelligence as Kant represents it to us is bathed in the atmosphere of spatiality to which it is inseparably united as a living body to the air it breathes," end quote. This is necessitated in Kant's thesis that pure space is always already the form of sensation, without which we would have no coherent experience at all. But instinct is a real form of knowledge which puts us in immediate relation with the movement and duration of things themselves. As Bergson says, this never, quote, "occurred to Kant in the first place because he did not think the mind overflowed the intellect, and in the second place because he did not attribute to duration an absolute existence, having put time a priori on the same plane as space." This is the real kernel of Bergsonism. We cannot think of real duration in spatial terms. Even the intellect needs to be understood in its duration. In the duration, the intellect develops alongside our practical and technical needs in life. Therefore, perception and intellect are structured on our capacity for embodied behavior. The intellect grasps the form of things by representing the spatial and qualitative relations with matter. But these relations are correlates of our possible action. Quote, "The essential function of intelligence is therefore to see the way out of a difficulty in any circumstance whatever, to find what is most suitable. It bears essentially on the relations between a given situation and the means of utilizing it." Instinct organizes life without the need of obligation. Like Kant, obligation arises with the consciousness of choice, which accompanies the intellect, but unlike for Kant, it cannot be the intellect or reason which is the source of the sense of obligation. The intellectual concretization of obligation is only a movement in the direction of torpidity, a hibernation of the élan vital into the fixed structure of laws. Quote, "It is this rigidity which we objectify when we attribute so stern an aspect to duty." End quote. The essence of the élan vital makes its most self-defining expression in the exemplary lives of Christ, Buddha, Muhammad, and to varying degrees the mystic figures of all traditions. These dispositions cannot be expressed in any determinate image or law, but is the active, unconditional love, agape, which manifests in a creative act. As Bergson says, quote, "The ultimate end of mysticism is the establishment of a contact, a partial coincidence with the creative effort which life itself manifests." Unquote. The unconditional love of agape is only the most developed form of the élan vital. Bergson insists on a difference in kind between unconditional love and the love which is related to the ego. Not just self-love, but more importantly, the social ego, and with it, all of our sense of social obligation. This does not mean that obligation is eliminated for the mystic, but that the source of obligation is changed. The mystic no longer interacts with others from a sense of obligation, but only interacts with a non-egotistical benevolence and compassion. All social obligation is imposed, even if it is self-imposed, it is in the form of a categorical imperative. Unconditional love, on the other hand, is an attraction to act compassionately. It is evident in the most moral figures that they appear to us as attractive rather than as imposing a demand. As Bergson says, quote, "When, in imagination, we call to life these great moral leaders, when we listen to their words and see them at work, we feel that they communicate to us something of their fervor and draw us in their wake. It is no longer a compulsion. It is a more or less irresistible attraction." End quote. It is easy to see how attraction has a direct affiliation with the energy of life and creativity, while obligation imposes limits on morality and creativity. Indeed, it is the spirit of obligation as an alignment with the torpid, immobility, and inactive tendency which makes it so alien to the spirit of open society. Between the closed society of laws and obligations and the open society of unconditional love is a difference between repose and movement. Quote, "The first is supposed to be immobile. If it changes, it immediately forgets that it has changed, or it acknowledges no change. The shape it assumes at any given time claims to be the final shape, but the second is forward thrust. It demands for movement. It is the very essence of mobility." End quote. While closed morality operates with a cumulative justice where vice is repaid with punishment, open morality operates on forgiveness as a creative expression of unconditional love. The duality of tendencies that persist in Bergson's thinking, matter and duration, torpidity and movement, instinct and intellect, law and love, these dualisms are not intended to be antitheses, but rather are mutually determining and coexistent, a community of tendencies in the élan vital. Matter is the abstract image of movement, and while movement is the continuous activity of material reality, matter is the resistance to élan vital. But without resistance, life would never produce forms. Matter is, in reality, a temporalized field of universal interaction, not reducible to entities or substances. As Bergson writes, quote, "The more physics advances, the more it effaces the individuality of bodies and even the particles into which the scientific imagination began to decompose them. Bodies and corpuscles tend to dissolve into universal interaction." End quote. The field of universal interaction, just like an electromagnetic field, has relative centers of activity which are individuated only by degrees of mutual determination. Reality is a field of mutually determined movements and changes prior to there being objects or substances. It is only our perception which divides the field into full-fledged entities. Quote, "Our perception gives us the plan of our eventual action on things more than that of things themselves. The lines that we see traced through matter are just the parts on which we are called to move. Only by suspending our practical interest, especially the interest of the social ego, can we awaken our intuition and coincide with the world in its duration and mutual interdependence. We are reciprocally determined with all of life, with even the most divergent tendencies of the élan vital. In the development of the superior moral disposition in line with the élan vital, we fully realize our mutual dependence in the community of all existence, not as a totality of substances, material bodies, or images, but in the community of our real duration and interdependence, which is always still being created in acts of sympathy and unconditional love. So that's where the paper ends. I feel that there was a huge gap there between Kant and Bergson that needed transition, and there needed to be a conclusion. So maybe I'll just add a couple thoughts now, 9 years later, after giving this paper. I mean, I think that the mutual determination of community in Kant's sense is that I feel an obligation to other people. I have a moral life because I see other people as having value in themselves, not being reducible to the value that I have in my discourse with the world, in my discourse with matter, in my attempt to please myself and be happy. And this determination is the beginning of the community. We start in community by being mutually determined. So my freedom emerges at all, is grounded, is founded by the fact that I am in mutual determination with other beings that I take as free. So it all kind of springs into existence at once. Now, Bergson's big move here, of course, is to temporalize this, but he still says, on the one hand, we are in a community of movement. Our movements are all interdependent and interdetermining of one another. This idea in Schelling that everything is gravitationally related to each other. We see this again in Whitehead. It's even in Leibniz in a big way. Everything is mutually determining everything else, and we are caught up in the whole community of movement. On the other hand, there is a community of aspiration. So just like Kant has the physical community, and then on the other hand, the moral community, Bergson also has this idea. But again, he radically temporalizes the moral side as he also does the movement side. And so we are in a dynamic community. I don't think Kant would necessarily say this, but we're in a dynamic community morally. Kant thinks that we're in a static and unchanging relation to one another. Now, we could say, well, is there perhaps something static and unchanging about agape, about unconditional love? Bergson would say no. He would say that this is a feeling. It is something that moves us. It is motivating. It is something like a vocation, a calling. And it puts us into a state of needing to invent. And again, is something transformational where I feel pulled and called by someone else. So who I am, how I act, how I define myself, my freedom as such, my identity, my person, my existence, is in relation to others and is formed through that shared aspirational sense and a shared responsibility to one another. And this idea of community as a type of resistance is key because people tend to look at Kant and rationalist philosophy, surrounding him through the lens of individualism and as a kind of, even if it's shifting away from the egoistic, bootstraps individualism, still ends in a kind of isolated subjectivity where we're the legislating automata or, legislator, whatever. And that this self is completely outside of time and that the temporal self is really just an illusion. In this new phrasing of it, through his understanding of community, there's something far more dynamic going on, even more dynamic than what Bergson allows for. Because this community is holding our wills together, and it is not as if these wills existed prior to their relationality to one another. It is by their feeling a resistance to one another, and it is by resisting each other's wills and egos to some degree that we actually live in community. And Bergson will talk about this in a number of ways as well, but we not only respect one another and feel responsibility to one another, but we also, as friends, need to set limits on one another. We need to say, hey, you're infringing on somebody else's ability to be their own self-determining agency. You're treating them as a means to an end. You're not allowing them to be an end in themselves. Now, these are not, the community of ends is not a collection of ends, and what by ends I mean goals, purposes, desires that are at odds with one another, because they're, like an organism, they form a whole so that the end is the end of the whole. Now, in the community of ends, as Kant understands it, this kind of eschatological future community, think of Augustine and the Christian ideas here. Kant is thinking of those, a kind of utopia of moral, where everyone treats each other with respect. This is also the aspiration of the mystic for Bergson. But Bergson wants to say, the way that we understand this, the way that this integrates into our lives, the way that we create metaphors and a system and even laws, that is going to be subject to change. And the exact way that we integrate our obligations and wills and responsibility needs to evolve and needs to change. And even the way that our technology is affecting our lives is going to be an obstacle to living in community with one another. So we have to actually learn anew as humanity changes how to live in community.